and prepping it correctly and the nutrients and all that all leads up to this actual installation part. And there's some tips and tricks that we would like to follow with that. The problem that we see a lot in landscapes is pictures like this. All three scenarios here, we have got something wrong going on. And the more you do this, the more you'll be able to recognize it, and you'll see it as you're driving down the highway and go, oh my gosh, look at how that tree is planted. So this picture here on the left, we have got a fairly mature tree. It's probably been in the ground for quite some time. And so it's been able to grow. It's been fine, but you can see that line right around the edge of the trunk. That's a girdling root. So that root was there in that round shaped fashion when it was planted. And as the tree grew, it eventually met up with that root. And as that trunk continues to expand, that root is going to just slowly cut off the tree. It's going to be a weak spot for the tree. It will inhibit water take up and movement throughout the plant. And if there's a storm or an injury to the tree, it's a good chance it could topple over right there. We see that a lot. So ultimately, this is not going to be a long-lived tree. It's eventually going to have to come out. There at the top right, there we have got a few things going on. Certainly the tree is planted too deep. I can tell that because it's just going straight down. There's no root flare. I cannot see the root flare. And see how that soil or that mulch really is piled up. We call that volcano mulch. We do not want to have that look. That mulch piled up against the trunk of that tree is going to promote fungal issues. Insects can move in. Once again, ultimately, it's going to destroy the health of the tree. Even here on the bottom, we don't have trees. We've got some shrubs. These are some boxwoods. And that poor fellow on the right there is yellow, which is chlorotic. There's that fun word. Now, I don't know exactly why it's chlorotic. I'm not physically there to stick my hands in the soil, but knowing the plant, because it's a boxwood and seeing where it is planted, it's most likely a soil type issue. It's probably too wet. We have got a sidewalk along with a brick lining there, and then like a foot behind it, there's the fence. That's an area that's going to hold water, and those types of plants do not like that, and then they're going to show their displeasure rather vividly with that fun yellow color. So on average, trees that we plant in a commercial setting, they only live for an average of 13 years, which is not very long, especially when it comes to plants. Things like maples and oak trees should live for 100, few hundred, 300-400 years. But what happens is we are planting them incorrectly. So they're not dead immediately, but they move on a slow pace compared to us, but 13, 15, 20 years down the line, and you end up with like this poor tree here on the left. He probably was planted about 10 years ago. He might have about 5 more years left, and then that's it. So that is what is going on. And so all of these things right here we need to be aware of, because we have control over these issues as landscape managers. We can correct compacted soils. Remember some of the things we talked about yesterday about tillage, adding in organic matter to make sure that there is enough space for air and water, adding in nutrients. Planting plants we need to make sure that there's enough space for their root system. Remember, the tree roots grow out, not down. So if you plant a big tree in a 4-foot by 4-foot little cutout in the middle of concrete, that's not much space for those roots to be able to establish itself and then be able to find the water and nutrients that it needs. A lot of times we see improper staking procedures, the biggest one really being that we leave the stakes there too long. And part of that is just, some of it's due to the industry, because the company that installs the plants usually isn't also the company that is then coming in later to maintain it. And the people who are doing the maintenance don't mess with the staking. Mechanical injuries, you see weed eater injuries where it's nicked on the side of a trunk, and that can prompt issues. Pedestrian and vehicle abuse, improper planting, of course. Over pruning is another big problem. It's probably one of the biggest issues that I see, certainly in the commercial landscape, is people out there cutting and pruning and kind of feel like that they need to do it a lot in order to feel like that they're doing a good job. And sometimes less is more when it comes to that. So when we are installing plants or very large shrubs, there's 3 different ways namely that we can get our plant material. There's a bare root, there's ball and burlap material, which is the picture right here, and then container or containerized plants. These three different types, they've got pros and cons to them. With ball and burlap is typically what you're going to get with larger trees. It's the easiest to transport. They grow them in the ground at the nursery, and then they dig them up typically in fall and then wrap up with burlap, sometimes with a wire cage as well, and then sell them. So when we are picking out these materials, we need to make some decisions based on what type of plant we're planting, where we're going to put them, as to what type of plant material we should get, and what we should look for. We certainly want to put in healthy plants. If a plant looks like it's fighting something, or it's not shaped right, or diseased, don't put that in the ground. You're going to spend so much more of your time trying to get that plant up to snuff, when it's going to be easier to reject that plant and make sure that you get one that's healthy. So look for the shape of it. Make sure that we've got a good shape to the branches, a good structure. Make sure we've got a good straight trunk. Make sure that the root system looks healthy. Look for disease and insect issues. So before planting is the time to look for these kinds of potential problems that could be coming up. And of course, don't forget to look up. See this problem a lot too. Make sure that you're not going to be planting that large tree underneath something that's going to inhibit its growth in a few years. Power lines is a big issue. They're around a lot. Certainly with older houses, you've got the line that goes directly to the house, and then people will plant a little small, maybe a little 5-foot tall tree. But then someday that 5-foot tall tree is going to be a 20-foot tall tree, and it's going to be in the power lines. And if this is near like the road, then what happens is the power company comes in and they just cut off the top of that tree, and then it's never going to look the same again. And look at this picture right here. They have slowly over time pruned out the middle of that entire tree, so it's growing on either side of the power line, which works, but think about where the weight is in that tree. It's on the sides and it's being pulled out. So if there's a storm, that tree could very easily just split right down the middle all the way to the crown of the trunk, and it's a safety hazard. See this with Bradford pears a lot. All right, so a good step-by-step to follow for planting trees. I said step one was look up, right? That's step one. Step two, we need to figure out how big should the hole be that we're going to dig for this tree. So you're going to measure or eyeball the root zone, the root ball of the plant. And so you're going to dig the hole about 90% as deep as what that root ball is. You do not want it to be deeper than the root ball. If anything, have it just a little bit on the short side. Should always be less deep than the root ball. Now this picture right here, because we see the picture of the guy measuring it. Now he's dug the hole, but that hole at the bottom is still really not what we want to do. He's got it, the depth correct, but he's going to need to go out. We want to dig out about 2 times the width of the diameter of that root ball. So that's going to help break up that soil around the edge, give the roots better penetration to get into that soil as it grows the first few years. So that's one thing we would want to do there. Also, before we put the root ball in the ground, we need to find that flare root, that topmost root. Sometimes it's very visible right there on the surface, and that's great, but also a lot of times you can't see it. They tend to get buried as they get potted from pot to pot when they're at the nursery. So the topmost root, it's going to be where it's that first root is emerging out from the trunk, kind of going a little bit sideways. You want to make sure that you know where that is and that it is just at the top of that root ball. A lot of times you're going to have to remove soil. With this picture here, it looks like that they removed about 4 to 5 inches of soil. You can see the different coloration on the trunk before they found the root ball. This is a critical thing to do. We've got to find that root flare. It should be obvious. Also be aware of the quality of the root balls. Some of them are better than others. So look at that root system, look at that root ball. A lot of times we will see like this image here on the right where we have got a lot of extra soil piled up around the edge of the roots at the top of the root ball, and we need to remove that soil. Now is the time when we're getting ready to plant these plants, not only these large trees, but also shrubs, even all the way down to some of the annuals and perennials that we plant. If there are any root issues, now's the time that we can fix it. In landscaping, certainly in the past, and for people who have not been in the industry long, there's kind of this weird thought that, oh, you shouldn't disturb the roots, or you shouldn't disturb the root ball. Don't squish it, don't poke it. It's delicate, it's tender. And it is, but sometimes the best thing that we can do as installers, as managers, is to mess with the root ball, break it up, score it, cut it. I have practically butchered almost some root balls, but it's ultimately better for the plant. So removing excess soil, looking for those girdling roots or too many roots, cutting all that up. This picture right here, which looks like it's a grassy type plant, maybe a liriope or something. Those look like monkey grass type roots. I mean, that is a mess. I would, at the very least, with that, I would get my fingers in there and try to kind of pull it out. Sometimes I'll get my fingers in at the bottom of that root ball and then kind of flare it out, butterfly it out to make the roots go out and not to continue in a circle. We see stuff like this all the time. So here on the left, we've got pretty dense looking ball of roots there, and they're cutting into it with a knife. And that is perfectly okay for most plants. That is, you're going to have better success with planting a plant after cutting through some of those roots, because that's practically a wall. It's like the Great Wall of China, but it's the Great Wall of roots. And if you just stick that directly in the ground, those roots have a propensity to just kind of keep growing in that general shape. So they're never going to grow out. So cutting the roots, it's just like pruning the top of the plant. We're encouraging growth. So we're encouraging root growth when we cut into the root system like that. A lot of times when you see root balls like that one there on the left, and you have got all those roots on the outside, and then you cut through that wall, and then there's just soil on the inside. The plant has pushed all the roots to the outside edge, because that's where the water and nutrients tend to be in containerized plants. It dribbles down the side. So you kind of just need to break it up, spread it out. We see like this issue here on the right a lot. That's like a big bowl of spaghetti. I mean, it's quite common and it's healthy. I mean, it's a healthy looking root system, but it is containerized, and we can help the plant have a better chance of success by manipulating this root system. You can cut some of those off. You're not going to kill that plant, especially if it's a grass. Promise you won't kill it. If we do not correct these root issues, we will see stuff like this later on. So this is it was a ball and burlapped tree that was planted a few years ago and then dug up, or at least air spaded around the roots. And we can see that even though the tree had been planted, a lot of those roots were just still going in a circle. A few were going out, but the tree is not going to be at its healthiest here. It's got a weak spot. It could be toppled over easily by wind. Eventually we could have girdling root issues here. So at planting time, what should have happened is those circular roots should have been cut, so they would not have continued to grow in that circle. So container grown plants, it's a particular issue because it makes those roots grow in that concentric circular shape, which eventually functions as like a noose around the whole root system of the plant. Even with shrubs, not just trees, but you want to look for that flare root, look for that flared trunk, because even with containerized shrubs, you will see that there's too much soil built on top, and it just happens over time. So any of these root issues that we're seeing, because now is the great time for us to check out this root system when we're planting the plants. And so any issues that we see, now's the time to fix it. We don't want to wait until it causes a problem. It's a preventative thing that we're going to do now. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we're going to look for those circling roots, look to make sure that we've got the flare root up at the top of the soil surface, loosen up that root ball, cut off sides of it if you need to. Some people will even go as far as to wash off the entire soil media off of the root system and essentially create a bare root plant. Some people swear by that method. And it's something you can do. In fact, here's what this is they have removed all of the soil, all that soil media from the root system here. And like I said, you can't do it all the time. It takes more time and it's messy. Typically, you're going to do it with like a hose. And so you're just washing, making mud somewhere. But it does give you the benefit that you're able to see visually the entire root system. You can see any potential problems. You can prune as necessary and then plant them in the ground as a bare root plant, which have a pretty high rate of success because of the root issue that you're able to deal with any root issues here. Like I said, there's some people in the industry that will swear by this method, and whether they buy ball and burlap or containerized, and they will wash all the soil off. You can, for the most part. And I've done it sometimes and it works. It just takes time. And that's what's happened here. Here we've got this tree, top left. They've pulled it out of the container. And that's what you kind of typically see. He kind of shakes it a little bit there at the top right. And then by the bottom, he has washed off all the soil. And now at the bottom right, he's pulled out that whole root system. So look, that entire root system there at the bottom right was all wrapped up together in that little pot. So taking the time to fixing these issues now and spreading those root systems out while they're still pliable and young, and then putting it into the soil, that tree is going to have a much, much better chance at having a nice long life. So it takes a bit more time, but it is worth it. We want to avoid this. Circling roots will eventually become girdling roots. Like this one here on the right in particular, you can see. Now, if I see this in the landscape, I could probably still fix it. I would come in and I would just cut that root. I would just cut it, perhaps cut it at one place on the left, another place on the right, and just remove it and kind of cross my fingers and hope that the tree is able to seal over that wound and correct itself. So if you catch it early enough, sometimes you can, but ideally what should have happened is at planting is when that should have been seen and fixed. Once again, if we do not fix these girdling root issues, it compromises the tree. Not only can the tree not get as much of the nutrients and water that it needs, but it's not able to anchor to the ground correctly like it's supposed to. And they're easier to be toppled over like this. This poor guy, you can see the girdling root, which it's not even girdling the plant yet. It's just encircling. But that large root there, it should have grown straight out so it could have anchored itself better to the ground, but it wasn't able to do that. So it just ended up being like a teeter-totter. All right, so after step 2, step 3 comes next, and we are going to dig that hole. Remember, it's not going to be quite as deep as the root ball, be close to it, about 90%, but then we should dig out twice as large as what the root ball is. If it's, ground that has not been broken up. If you're planting an entire new bed and you've turned up the entire area, you should be pretty good, but you want to dig out that hole, loosen up that soil, remove that soil in preparation that it's going to be going back in. We're not going to completely remove it and haul it off, even if it's bad soil. Hopefully we can correct that with amendments, but we're not going to wholesale replace the soil. Step 4, put the tree in the hole. Sometimes you might need to adjust it a few times, like this guy here. He stuck this ball and burlap tree in the hole. It's probably still a bit high right there. He's going to need to take it out, dig down a little bit more. Definitely needs to dig out more as well. So sometimes there's an adjustment factor going in. Excuse me. Put in the tree. Say, okay, I need to dig it down a few more inches. Take it out, dig down some more. And so there's a little bit of adjustment going on. Better to measure twice or 3 times. Here, this one's too deep. They set that one in and it's going down maybe about 4 or 5 inches. You can also see where they had to remove soil to find that flare root. It's like an oak tree, can't tell exactly. So this is what can happen if we do not find that flare root. The tree, remember the tree's root system, not only is it going to anchor the plant to the ground, but it's also is what's pulling up water and nutrients for the plant. And where in the soil is the water and the nutrients? It's in that top foot or so, topsoil. So if you're planting a tree that has been buried too deeply in the pot, and so the roots are down an extra foot into the soil, the tree's going to have to try to compensate for that. If it wants the water and the nutrients, it's going to sometimes try to force to grow a completely separate root system up near the top so that it can survive. Some plants can do this pretty well. A willow tree could probably handle this just fine, but that does weaken the tree because it's having to spread out its resources. And then that's going to make it more susceptible to disease issues, insect issues, and things like that. It's going to encourage weird root growth, girdling roots. And you end up with something like this, and later on the tree dies, and you're like, well, why'd the tree die? You dig it up and you see it's got two completely separate root systems. After you get the hole correct, make sure that you get the tree straight. Look at it from a few different directions. Just because it looks straight one way, it could still be leaning away from you and you can't really see it. So make sure that it's straight. Now's the time to correct it, and always check it as you're backfilling the soil too, because that can make it go wobble from one way to the other. If it is a ball and burlap, at the very least, remove the burlap from the top of the root ball where it's touching the trunk of the tree and pull it back and down the sides. Like I said, at the very least, ideally if you can. And sometimes it's hard because ball and burlap trees are really heavy, but if you can, get all the burlap off all the way. If it's synthetic, definitely remove it off all the way. Synthetic burlap is made from plastic and it's not going to degrade. Straight up burlap will, but it will take time. It can still form a hindrance. Like I said, at the very least, we want to remove it from the top, because what can happen is if you don't, is that it will serve as a wick and wick all the water away from the trunk of the tree, from the root zone. And that's no good. Like I said, if the burlap is synthetic, get it all off, because it's not going to break down. That's what happened with this poor tree here. Look at that big chunk of thing there. And so they planted it thinking leaving the burlap is fine, but that's plastic burlap. And the tree was having to fight tooth and nail trying to get through that stuff. And eventually what will happen with some of those larger roots, looking at it on the bottom picture there, is as those roots grow bigger and get bigger in diameter, that plastic's going to choke it off at each little point where those roots are coming out of the bag. And eventually that's going to kill the tree. All right, so you've got your tree straight, you've got the hole planted correctly. Now we've got to put the soil back in around the base of the tree. We're going to put back in the original soil. You're not going to amend the soil unless you're amending like the entire area of the soil, but it's going to need to be the original soil. If you put in, like, say, well, why not get some potting soil, some really nice soil, and just put that around the tree? Isn't that lovely? And it is. But then what's going to happen is the tree is going to want to keep its roots in that soil and never venture out into the native soil. And then you end up with this bathtub effect. So we want to use the original soil broken up. Sometimes as you pack it in, you water it down a little bit. And that's what's going on here. You can, and don't pack it. We're not trying to make, mud pies here. We're just pack it in just enough to be able to hold that tree in place. Watering it in again when the area is all filled up. That's going to help that soil settle down a little bit. For our larger trees, we might want to build a berm, which is like a little raised hill of soil that's going to go around the edge of the root ball. We don't want to build it too big, don't need it to be too crazy, and it doesn't need to be permanent. We don't want it to be permanent, but it's what that's going to do is just kind of serve as a little bit of a dam to hold some water in around the root ball, give it time to soak in before it goes running off. After a year or two, you can push down that berm. We don't want that to be there permanently, but it's going to help us while that tree is establishing itself. And then we want to add some mulch. 2 inches is good. Here it says a minimum of 2 inches. 2 inches of mulch is fine. You do not want the mulch to be touching the actual trunk of the tree. Give it just a little bit of space. Once you want to hold moisture against the trunk of the tree. And give it a good, good mulched round area of space. Not only is this going to help keep the root system of the tree cooler, keep water locked in, but it's going to keep persnickety landscape equipment from getting too close to the trunk of the tree and nicking it. You'll see trees planted in the middle of someone's yard. In fact, I'm just looking across the street right now, and a neighbor of mine has a maple tree out in his yard, out in the middle of the grass. Grass grows right up to the trunk of the tree. And if you're weed eating around the edge, you're nicking that tree every time, creating wounds, weakening the tree. See this with crepe myrtles too. As the tree grows, the mulched area should grow too. Grass is not going to grow very well right up next to the trunk of most trees. Not only is there too much shade, but the tree is taking up all the water. So give it space. And as the tree grows, let that mulch area grow. Probably what's going to happen here with this picture, as these trees have grown and their little mulch area has expanded, now's the time to probably go ahead and make that just one huge mulched area, because now you've got more mulch than grass, and that's kind of a maintenance issue there with having to do all that edging and all that cutting in those itty bitty little areas in that picture. So we don't want to let our turf grass grow up to the trunk of the tree. The tree isn't going to like it. The turf grass isn't going to like it. They're competing. They will compete for nutrients, compete for moisture, compete for sun. And then we have that lawnmower equipment damage issue as well. Mulching issues. I see a lot of mulching issues. Volcano mulch is a big one, like this picture right here. And that's a double whammy right there on the left. Not only is it volcano mulch, but it's that red mulch, which me as a designer, I have an issue with. I am not a fan. So you don't need to pile on mulch season after season. We do want to replenish mulch. And every once in a while, it's certainly beneficial to remove the old mulch completely and then put some more on there. We can do that. One of the other issues that you'll have with this, as that mulch is piled up like that, mulch is an organic matter, at least usually, and it's going to break down into soil, and the tree might begin to send its root system up into the mulch, looking for water, for soil, nutrients, and all that. And then if there's like a drought, it's going to dry out pretty quickly, and the tree will suffer. Look at this poor thing here on the left. That thing is piled up with mulch. And this poor guy here on the right, I mean, this is just a very common issue that we see with mulch. Too much mulch. Looks like a big old fire ant bed. Here is a consequence of another mulching issue. We have got, this was a row of holly shrubs, and they brought them into the extension service here. This is probably about 15 years ago now. And they had all suddenly up and died. And so they had the lady bring in the actual plant, the tree, and here's what it was. And what had happened was, when they had planted these shrubs, it's probably little 1 or 3 gallon plants, and they felt like they were doing it all the right way, and they put down that plastic landscape fabric, that you can put down there, which controls weeds, right? And it was there 10 years later, and then they added mulch each year, was adding mulch to make it look nice, as one should. And then what happened was, as that mulch broke down, decomposed on top of that landscape fabric and created that organic matter, that soil, the shrub began to put out roots above the landscape fabric until the majority of the root system was above that fabric. And then we had a pretty bad drought. I want to say it was 2007, 2008, something like that. And we weren't allowed to water. And then there was no more water above the landscape fabric. And then all the plants up and died. So there is one of a multitude of reasons why I personally do not like landscape fabric. So you can have issues like that. After we get our tree planted, we've got to get it staked and guided. And there's a few different ways to do it. Some of it's going to depend on what you're comfortable with for the tree, for the area. Ideally, if you can get by without having to do much staking and guying, you're going to be better off for a few different reasons. One, you're not going to have to go back in a year and remove everything. 2, there's not as much of a trip hazard or a liability issue there. But sometimes you got to stake the tree. If you don't, it's going to get toppled over in wind. So we want to make sure that we're getting it correctly. Now here on the right, this illustration is showing how we have got 3 lines going from the tree to the stakes. Notice how the stakes are banged into the soil at an angle, kind of pointing toward the root ball. That's going to give it more grip to the soil. If you have them go straight down, it's going to be easier for them to get pulled out as the tree moves from side to side. And that's one thing you want to make sure is that the tree does have a little bit of room for give. Those wires should not be super tight. We don't want to be putting too much pressure against the trunk of the tree. That tree needs to be able to move a little bit. That's going to help it establish a root system a bit better. So there's different ways to do it. You can stake it through the root ball as well. I don't know if we have that picture or not. Yeah, there's the the root ball staking method. Here you do want to use wood stakes that are not treated or something like that so that they will degrade after a few years. You might need to prune up the plant a little bit as you're finishing up. Mainly, if I'm doing that, I'm looking for anything that's obviously broken, has been snapped while being planted. I'm not going to over prune. I've seen some people recommend that you should take all the leaves off a tree when you plant it so that then the tree puts more effort into growing the root system. But that's not what the tree is going to do. It's going to also try to replenish those leaves. So don't take all the leaves off the plant. It's not going to help the tree. If anything, it's going to hurt it. Should we put out fertilizer at planting? Some people do. There's a few different schools of thought on it. If you do, I would say use something that has pretty low concentration of nitrogen, or something that's slow release. Something that's too high or quick releases perhaps could burn the plant. If anything, I would wait for maybe a month or so and then start doing some light fertilization. Ideally, some fertilization was added, some nutrients were added as soil was being prepped way back before we even bought the tree. And then the tree has got to have a chance to establish itself. Once we plant a plant in the ground like that, whether you're having to do any kind of heavy cutting to the root ball or not, plants did not evolve to get moved like that. Remember, they grow, live, and die in one place. So anytime that we're moving a plant, taking it out of a pot, taking a ball and burlap, and then planting it in the soil, we're stressing out that plant. They're not really equipped to be moved like that. So think about these plants when we first plant them. It's almost like they're an ICU patient. We have got to help them recover from the stress of planting. So we get the plant in the ground, and then now the critical period begins. With most trees, shrubs, 3 gallon, 5 gallons, I would tell my clients, about at least the next 4 weeks, we have to be very vigilant about how the tree is growing, how the plants are growing, making sure that they're getting enough water, because that plant has been compromised by that planting process. The larger the plant, the longer it's going to take to get established. Here it gives us that good rule of thumb, about 3 to 4 months of establishment time per inch trunk caliper. So if you have planted a 4-inch caliper tree, which is a pretty good sized tree, then that tree is going to take a good year to really establish itself. So during that establishment period, we're adding supplemental irrigation. So even if there is an existing irrigation system, those irrigation systems are designed for established landscapes. So we're going to need to provide supplemental irrigation. For trees, honestly, one of the best things you can get is they're called gator bags or water bags. And it's like looks like a big old plastic trash bag almost, that you can set or wrap it around the tree, sits over the root ball, and it slowly drips out water. Then you fill it up once every day or so with a hose. Those are great because it's a constant small amount of water to keep that soil constantly moist while that root zone establishes itself. So watering, should we water a lot or water frequently? It's definitely frequency during this establishment period. We're wanting to keep that area constantly wet, not over much so, but water needs to be on hand. That root system has been compromised and the plant cannot as easily find the water as it will once it's established. Remember, the plant has got to go through that process of transpiration. All right, that is that. Like I said, that was pretty much a good review from stuff that Fred talked about. Any questions on that? All right. Well, what I'm going to do next is I have got a plant identification video I want to show you guys. Now, for this class, there's not going to be identification per se on the exam. We're not going to have an example of an oak tree and say, please tell me what this plant is. So don't fret too much about all these different plants I'm about to throw at you. The biggest thing here, what I want you to get from this is to know what's out there as far as the different types of plants. You know, it's just kind of, you might, as you go watch this video, you might say, oh, okay, I have that plant in my front yard. Now I know what it is. And as we look through these videos, I'll be talking, because it's me talking over the video, some of the specific issues that we will run into with some of these plants, things to look for identification, things that we like about the plant. And like I said, it's just helpful to know what's all out there. Let's see, I'm going to do this one first, I think, because it is the evergreen one. Let me make sure I hit all the right buttons for you guys. Wrong button. Okay. Share screen, share sound. And this. Okay, so we're going to look at some evergreen shrubs. There's quite a few out here. We'll hit the highlights. This first one right here, this is Distilleum. Now this is a relatively new-ish evergreen shrub that has shown up on the scene. I mean, 10 years ago I hadn't even heard of this plant, and now I've been seeing it more and more. I've seen it at every garden center. You can see it at Lowe's and Home Depot. There's different varieties. Well, I believe this variety is Vintage Jade. There's also Cinnamon Girl. There's one called Linebacker, I think, that has larger leaves. This is an evergreen shrub. It is, as far as identification, the biggest way I identify this one actually is the habit, the form of it. You see how it has these long branches that kind of arch up and over, is one of the biggest things that I notice about it. It kind of, in the landscape, to me, it's kind of replacing, or it's a better choice to replace autoleucon cherry laurels, which tend to get shot hole fungus pretty bad. It kind of has that look. So far, I've been really pleased with this one. I believe this is its third summer here. As you can see, I planted it as a 3-gallon shrub, and it's grown, I mean, it has grown a fair amount, but it's not going to get much bigger than this. I believe it's 3 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet wide. Some of the other varieties get bigger, so that's why I went with this one. It is evergreen, like I said. We have got, as far as the leaves go, they're fairly nondescript. You've got, it's kind of almost lanceolate leaves, come to a little tip. They are alternately arranged, as you can see here. You can see it's got like little new, I guess it's a little new leaf right there. Also the branching, see how these kind of come off 45 degree angle from the main stem? That's pretty typical. Like I said, this is a fairly new plant, so as far as long-term pest issues that it has, or disease issues, I haven't really run up on anything yet. Every once in a while I kind of get these little yellowing leaves in the center, and that's just what's going to happen. So kind of like a gardenia in that sense. This one gets really full sun. They can do full sun to part shade. I imagine they do fine in more shade even. They might get a little bit leggier, but it's just a good, as far as in the landscape, it's just a good evergreen shrub. As far as maintenance goes with this one, because of this arching habit, and I'm going to say this over and over again, with, you know, a plant that has this arching habit, you do not want to shear this shrub, because you're going to lose this form. This is not meant to be a little ball. It's meant to arch up and over, like a loropetalum or an abelia. So you might do a little bit of pruning, but also really, because the size of this plant is not going to get very big, you shouldn't have to prune it. I haven't had to touch these at all since I installed them a few years ago. So don't mess with this plant much. Just let it be happy. Make sure you're getting enough water. And other than that, it's pretty low maintenance. Our next evergreen shrub here, this is a camellia. This is a Sasanqua camellia. This one's a pretty large one. It's actually, 10 feet tall, I would suppose. So this is a Sasanqua. Sasanqua camellias bloom in the late fall, or mid to late fall, dependent on the variety. This variety, I'm not sure what the name of it is. It has a pink flower, and the flower starts to show up about 1 to 2 weeks before Halloween for me. There are some other varieties that will bloom a little later. If it is a Japanese camellia or japonica, it's going to bloom more in the dead of winter, around January, February. Sasanquas tend to bloom in the fall. This is evergreen. For identification, when we look at the leaf, first off, it is alternate leaf arrangement, so 1 leaf per node. Also, if you look at the leaf itself, it does have a serration to the margins. The leaf shape is oval, and it has this little, almost a stretched out, like a drip tip. And you can kind of see, like here, you got the little tip, the way it arches over, like that. So, also we have got here, it's just now starting to form buds. This is going to be the flower bud here in a few months. Camellias, a few different things. They do get scale. Let's see if we can find some scale on this one. So it will get scale. You can see on this leaf right here, some T-scale. Now it's not going to kill the plant unless you have a very large infestation of it. Mainly it's going to cause this chlorosis due to the stippling damage where the insect is sucking out the chlorophyll. And here we have a hummingbird that's very mad at me. So mad because I am near his food. How dare me. He is so mad. Like I said, the different varieties is going to dictate how big it's going to get. There are actually some like Shishi Garshira that is more of a spreader. Now this one is more of an upright variety, whatever it is. I'm actually trying to espalier it on the side of the house there. And we'll see. It might work, it might not. Part shade. If it's full shade, it'll grow, but it might not flower as much. Though honestly, they can actually handle a fair amount of sun. This one gets sun from sunrise to about maybe 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon in the summertime. So that's full sun, really. That's why it's so dense, and the leaves are probably a little smaller than if it was in a shadier area. Our next evergreen shrub is gardenia. This is actually a dwarf gardenia, Gardenia radicans. The straight species like a daisy gardenia or frost-proof are going to be bigger, and the leaf is going to be wider. So the leaf on these gardenias here is pretty, what I call lanceolate. Very thin, pinnate leafination, comes this little tip. A couple of ways that I identify gardenias. For one, the color. It's a very green, like in a nice way. Like it's not olive or dark, it's a very bright shiny green. The leaves are also very shiny and almost rubbery in the way that they kind of whirl towards the tip as well. A couple other things, it is opposite leaf arrangement, which you can kind of see there. Also, in the summertime, you're going to have some flowers. So white flowers in the summer sporadically. Pretty fragrant too, actually. You can see how it kind of, as it unravels there, right there. So that's mainly why this one is going to be found in the landscape, because of the flowers. It's very fragrant. These are about 15 feet from my front door, and I mean, the smell about knock you off your feet when you step out in the morning. It is evergreen. They do take full sun. That's what the tag's going to say when you buy it, full sun. Though I have found, and this is just my anecdotal experience, that they don't like that afternoon sun. And these don't get that afternoon sun. This is on the east side of my house. So they get full sun once again up until about 2 or so, and then they're in the shade for that hot afternoon. One thing I found with dwarf gardenias is like they're either very happy or they're dead. These are pretty happy. Dwarf gardenias aren't going to get very tall. These, like I said, because these are very happy, they're probably about almost 3 feet tall, and I've had to trim them back a little bit. I think there's 3 in here. Got them growing together in a nice form. Here is our next evergreen shrub. This is spreading plum yew. Some people call it dwarf plum yew, or just yew. It is a plum yew. It's not a true yew. It's not a true taxus. This is Cephalotaxus, I believe. And this is the spreading version. So this one kind of has this low spreading habit. I want to say in all total there's a grouping of 5 here. They've all grown together, and it's about 3 feet tall or so. Once again, the tag on these, it's going to say part sun. These pretty much get full sun, and they seem pretty happy for it. They seem to tolerate a bit more sun than what they're sold as. So these do pretty good. It is a conifer. It is evergreen. This is evergreen shrubs. The leaf are these little needle-like leaves. It's very soft, nice green. This is not like a juniper. You can touch it. It's not going to poke you. Sometimes you'll get these dead leaves here. I just need to come cut that out, or I could do that. Once again, it kind of also has this 45-degree angled branching here. It's pretty thick, pretty low maintenance. It's conifer, it's not going to flower. What you're getting from this in the landscape is this evergreen foliage with this really nice ferny texture. It's not going to flower, it's not really going to have, I've never really found like wasp nests in it, like what you find with juniper. You always find a wasp nest. I have not found that with these. Once again, it could be anecdotally. And of course, here is Loropetalum, evergreen shrub, very popular. Now this one, it is a red leaf variety. As you can see, it has gotten pretty green. I believe that is because I planted these about 3 months ago, and it's still kind of working on settling itself in. So it's probably needing a little bit more fertilizer than what I've given it so far. You can see it has pushed out some newer leaves here that are red. So in general, the more sun, the more fertilizer, and the more red the red leaf varieties are going to be. There is a green leaf variety as well. I'm trying to remember the name of this one. Purple something. They're all purple something. It's evergreen as far as identification. And this one, the habit, you can't really see it because it's pretty new, but the habit will kind of have this arching overform, a lot like the Distilleum. This one is still establishing itself, so we don't really have that yet, though we're starting to think about it. The leaf itself, it's very, not fuzzy, but it's kind of scratchy, feels like a cat's tongue. And it is pretty oval, like a thumbprint shaped, pinnate. You can see an alternate leaf arrangement too. It's you can kind of hear that scratchiness to it. Once established, fairly tolerant of our heat and the amount of rain that we get. They do produce a bloom. It's mainly in the spring that's pink, and that's kind of showy, and they'll do it sporadically throughout the summer, but mainly while we plant these in the landscape is for that purple color, for the shape of it. Once again, these are kind of abused a little bit in the landscape. They will get sheared into balls, and that's not how they want to be. They want to have this arching over effect. So if these are in the right place, you shouldn't have to prune them at all. One of the problems is what they're marked as on their tags. Sometimes they get way, way bigger than what the tag says they're going to be, and you'll buy a variety that says it gets 2 to 3 feet, and then before you know it, it's 5 feet or something. So make sure that you're planting this in a place where it has a lot of room, because there still seems to be a lot of variation in size. Right here is Pittosporum. This is a fairly new plant. It is eventually going to get way bigger. It's probably going to be about every bit 6 to 8 feet. Just planted these a few months ago, and I have got a weed in it. Evergreen plant. This is Wheeler's dwarf. It's not the variegated Wheeler's dwarf, which is more popular. You see that more often. This is just the straight species Wheeler's dwarf. With Pittosporum, the main way I'm going to identify it, a couple of things. One, the leaf, it's very round, but it's wider at the tip than it is towards the base. You can especially see this with some of the older leaves, like this right here. See how it tapers down to a tip as you get towards the petiole. Also, the way that the leaves whirl around the tips is very Pittosporum-y. You can see it here with this branch in particular. See that? And they kind of gather towards the tips. There's some different varieties. Like I said, there's a variegated variety. These are salt tolerant. You see these down towards the beach a lot. They are not very tolerant of cold. In fact, I have lost some before due to some cold winters, and I am in zone 8A in Birmingham. So you go Birmingham south, you're going to see these a lot. You go up to North Alabama, they're probably not going to be able to handle the cold there. Good evergreen shrub, fairly tolerant once established. This is another one of those, you really don't want to shear it. It does naturally do this little balled up form. It's not going to have an arching effect or anything, but if the leaves are so big, you're not going to want to shear this one. It doesn't get too much in the way of pests. Haven't had any problem with deer eating it as opposed to everything else around here, so that's nice. And here is our next evergreen plant. This is a holly. It's actually the only holly that I've actually got on my property, so we'll look at it. So this is an inkberry holly. Most hollies are evergreen. There are some deciduous ones, but this one is evergreen. It is called inkberry because it produces little black berries in the fall and winter. Not overly showy, but it's something. All hollies are going to have alternate leaf arrangement. So if we look, we see you've got a leaf 1 leaf per node. All hollies are like that. That's going to be one of the telltale ways to tell that it's a holly versus something like a boxwood or an osmanthus. Now this is an inkberry. Like I said, it's going to get, about maybe 4 to 5 feet tall and wide eventually. Hollies in general are pretty tolerant. Heat, drought, water, shearing. The only thing that hollies really don't like is completely wet feet, though actually an inkberry can handle that pretty good. We see a lot of Chinese type hollies in the landscape, things like Nellie Bruners, Nellie R. Stevens, Emily Bruners, excuse me, needlepoints, Burford hollies. All those are kind of the Chinese holly with that very stiff, needle-like leaf that's very pokey. This is softer. There's some others that are softer. Hollies are pretty tolerant, and they grow fairly fast, fairly easy to propagate. So you find these a lot in the landscape just because of there's not very much cost involved, and certainly not with maintaining them really. Just once again, you want to put the right plant in the right place. A lot of those Chinese hollies, including dwarf Burford, can get very, very huge. I've seen dwarf Burford a story tall, and it has the word dwarf in its name, so don't just assume that means it's going to stay super small. Carissas can be pretty small, but they'll still be like 3 to 4 feet if you let it. And let's look at some azaleas. This is a type of indica azalea. Once again, it's still fairly young. A lot of my plants are just newly planted. It was my project for the year. This is a variety that is called George Tabor. So it's going to have a pink bloom in the spring. Eventually, this is going to get probably 6 feet fairly easily, maintained at 6. It'll probably want to get higher. I've got a grouping here of about 5 that they'll hopefully eventually grow in together. Filtered shade. Filtered shade, these do get sun to about midday. I'm hoping that they'll kind of be able to handle it a little bit better. We'll see. It also kind of depends on eventually. I've got a tree here that's going to get bigger, so these may or may not make it. We'll see. Now, as far as pest issues go, a lot of times you're going to see an azalea and the leaf is going to look like this. You see how it kind of has that little whitish or yellowish color to it? That is lacebug damage. And if I flip over this leaf, and there we can see the insects and the frass, their poop that they've left. Now, it's not enough to kill the plant, but it's going to make it look not quite as green. I could be putting a insecticide on it, perhaps something like a neem oil. I just haven't done that. So you get this a lot in the South. It's just something that's going to happen. And the leaf, even if I spray the insects and get rid of them, the leaf isn't going to recover. It's going to be the new growth that's going to be nice and green. There is a variety or a group of indica azaleas, or one of the parents is an indica azalea, of encores, which is the newer azalea in the landscape, and they bloom multiple times a year, hence the name. They're a bit more popular. I do have a few here on the property. They also don't get quite as big as well, but same issues as far as the type of environment that they need, the lace bug issue that we have. One nice thing about azaleas in general, actually, is they can handle a good renewal pruning every now and again. In fact, sometimes they're probably better for it. Maybe once every 10 years or so, you can cut these suckers back just about to the ground, and then they'll fluff out and be perhaps all the happier for it. Just don't shear these. Let's not shear these. They still, I mean, they're going to stay a nice roundish shrub. Just don't shear them. You can prune them a little bit. Just put them in the right place where it's okay that they want to get to the size that they want to get to. Here's our next evergreen shrub. This is anise. Some people say anise. I learned anise. Alyssium parviflorum, Alyssium floridanum, all of those. Here is the leaf. It's kind of the way I identify this one. The leaf itself, it's fairly large, so it's bigger than an azalea leaf. This is probably about 4 inches long or so. And that main mid vein is this very nice bright green, whereas the rest of the veins, you kind of blend in with the rest of the blade of the leaf. Also, the way that the leaves sit on the branch, they kind of stick up. And this one's a little bit thirsty, and I think a deer's been eating at it. And that's why it looks like that. So, green stems until you go pretty much this is the new growth from this year. You can see the previous year is this brown. Alternate leaf arrangement until you get to the tips, and it's almost more like a whorl around the tips. has a little flower. Sometimes it's strap shaped. This one, there's this right there. And then it'll produce the anise fruit, the star shaped fruit, which it's starting to do right there. And it's like what you use in a lot of like Asian dishes and pho and things like that. It's pretty good. Kind of like licorice. And that's another thing you can do to identify it. Both the leaf, like with the petiole, where the petiole meets the stem, and the leaf itself, if you crack it and smell it, it smells like licorice. That, you know, the black jelly bean, which is not my favorite thing, but it's very fragrant in that sense, and that's one way that you can identify it. Needs a little bit of shade. I've seen them in full sun, though I think they do better with a little bit of shade. These get probably about, golly, maybe just 3 hours of direct sun. It's mainly a filtered shade area right here. Got a few more evergreen plants for you. This is Fatsia japonica. Just planted a little while ago, like a month. It's going to get bigger. It's probably going to get 4 or 5 feet tall and wide. It has a very large, and it's going to get larger than this as it gets more established, large palmately lobed leaf, palmate venation, very coarse serration. Needs fair amount of shade. It's in the sun right now, and it probably is in the sun like for about like an hour or so, right in midday. And then after that, it's in the shade, and it's doing okay so far. Newer growth is lighter green and glossier. Older growth is darker. Has a very nice, coarse, large texture. Kind of has that tropical feel. You go much north than Birmingham, it's probably going to need a bit more protection from the cold. Hopefully this one will make it. I just put it in, but so far it seems doing all right. And this guy right here, he is a banana shrub, Michelia figo. Got 3 of them right here. Eventually he's going to be pretty big. Called a banana shrub because when it does have its bloom, it kind of smells like bananas. It's related to a magnolia. It's close to a magnolia, and mainly how you're going to identify it. It's kind of hard to identify, honestly. It's fairly nondescript leaf, entire margin, little tip to it. You can kind of see these new buds. See how it's kind of fuzzy? A lot of magnolias will do that. And eventually this will be kind of a little hedge deal. That speckledy stuff on the leaf is actually cayenne pepper that I have put out here because I have got some crazy deer and they have been eating on a lot of things. In fact, you can kind of see I planted a ghost pepper over there, and the deer like ate most of it off. I'm surprised it didn't give them upset stomach actually, because it's pretty hot pepper. But they haven't touched these yet, so that's good. Evergreen, part shade, I would say. It can handle some sun. It might could handle full sun. It might suffer the first year though. All right, and that's what I've got for evergreen.